No, Elisha said to him, "Go in peace." I take that to mean that Elisha was saying, I understand. I understand that it's not always easy living in a nation where your government compels you to do certain things that you know are wrong. But go in peace and trust that when those situations do arise, God will show you what to do. In many respects, the dilemma that General Naaman faced is very similar to the dilemmas that we face even today. What are we to do when our government tells us to do something, but when our faith in God tells us that that's something that we shouldn't do? Who has the final say over us? Our government or God? To a large degree, that's what led Pittsburgh Bishop Zubik and many other Roman Catholic bishops across the country to issue fiery condemnations of the federal government for trying to require them to do something that goes against their religious beliefs. In particular, they've been protesting the fact that new government regulations would require Catholic-related hospitals and social welfare organizations to make birth control devices available and to disperse medications that could induce abortions, something that the Catholic Church is vehemently opposed to. And so far, the federal government has basically been saying, we don't care if you think that God disapproves of our laws or regulations. You have to do what we say. In the news right now, that's undoubtedly the most blatant example of the government trying to intrude into religious life. But consider the other subtle ways that that also happens. For instance, as Christians, Jesus teaches us to pray to God, "Give us this day our daily bread." As Christians, we're taught to look to God to provide for us. But today in our country, nearly 46 million people, nearly 1 out of every 6 people in the United States receives food stamps from the federal government. In a very real sense, the government is saying, don't pray to God or look to the church for help. Look to your government. We'll take care of it. Don't get me wrong, hunger is a real problem, and people in need to be cared for. But if you read the book of Acts in the New Testament, you find that one of the very first ministries that the Christian church undertook was to feed the hungry and to care for the poor. That was one of the main ways that the Christian faith put their faith into action. But nowadays, the government has basically taken over the role of caring for people, something that historically has been done by the church and by people of faith. For example, consider the story in Genesis about Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, and it was to Joseph that his father gave that coat of many colors. But then, out of hatred and jealousy, his brothers took him and sold him to slave traders, who then transported him down to Egypt. But then, in time, the Egyptian Pharaoh discovered Joseph and elevated him to a high position in his government. At one time, Joseph interpreted a dream that the Pharaoh was having and said that the dream meant that in Egypt there would be 7 more years of good harvest followed by 7 years of famine. So right away, the Pharaoh appointed Joseph to do something about it. Well, what did Joseph do? Well, during those years of good harvest, Joseph taxed the people and took away 1/5 or 20% of all their income, and used that money to buy up all the excess food and put it into government storehouses. As a Hebrew, Joseph knew that the people owed to God a tithe, or 10% of their income. And so what's significant about the tax rate that Joseph imposed of 20% was that he had his government asserting a larger claim on the people than even God. And then when the years of famine came, what did Joseph do? When the people came and asked for food, Joseph said, well, first, give me all your money. And so gladly, the people handed over all their money, thankful that Joseph and his government would take care of it, even though the food he was giving them was food that he had originally taken away from them with their taxes. And then when the people were still hungry, Joseph said, well, since you don't have any money left, give me your livestock. Give me your valuables. And so gladly the people turned over all their livestock and their valuables, thankful that Joseph and his government were going to take care of them. And then when the people were still hungry, Joseph said, well, since you don't have any more money yet and no more livestock or valuables, give me your land and give me yourselves to be my slaves. And gladly the people handed over their land, and they handed over themselves to be slaves because they were thankful that Joseph and his government were going to take care of them, even though he was feeding them with the very food that he had taken away from them in the first place with his taxes. What does that story about Joseph teach us? Yes, it teaches us that hungry and hurting people need to be cared for. But it's also a warning to us that when we start to rely on the government to take care of us, when we start looking to the government to provide us with our daily bread, then whether we realize it or not, we are putting ourselves on a pathway where our freedom is going to be taken away. We're putting ourselves on a pathway that ultimately leads to slavery. I don't think it's mere coincidence that the only miracle that is recorded in all 4 of the Gospels is where Jesus takes a small amount of bread and fish, and after praying to God, he uses that to feed thousands of people. And at the end, there are baskets and baskets of pieces left over. And I don't think that it's mere coincidence